the Appalachian Mountains. Over 2,000 miles of wilderness where cell service dies, and sometimes people do too. In the next 20 minutes, you're about to hear 3 documented cases that made search and rescue teams refuse to go back. A solo hiker in eastern Kentucky, surrounded by whistles that copied his exact melody from 6 different directions. Search and rescue found him 3 days later, catatonic, unable to speak, only whistling the same 3 notes over and over. Then there's the inherited coal mining house in West Virginia where coal dust appeared every single morning no matter how many times it was cleaned, and what the couple found when they broke through the basement wall. 12 skeletons with company Scrip in their pockets and the mining company that buried them. It still exists today. And finally, 4 friends on the Appalachian Trail who met someone at a shelter, someone who smiled for 11 hours straight until his face bled. Someone who's been reported on that same trail for 15 years without aging. 7 hikers have disappeared on Blood Mountain since 2018. 2 were found dead from exposure, but they had food, water, and gear. They just stopped trying to survive. The other 5 were never found. And that smiling hiker, he's still out there. Here's what happened. Story 1. The Whistle Code. Hour 36 in Harlan Hollow, Daniel Pritchard had backed himself into a shallow cave like the rock could protect him from sound. The air was wet and cold, and his flashlight beam looked weak, like it hated the dark as much as he did. The whistling had stopped 20 minutes earlier, and the silence was the first thing that felt truly wrong, because silence meant whatever was out there had finally gotten close enough to listen. Then came the breathing. Slow and patient, just outside the circle of light. Daniel swept the beam across the cave mouth, left to right, fast enough to make his wrist ache, but the forest beyond stayed empty, tree trunks standing like witnesses. The breathing didn't stop. It moved. It crept along the edge of the light, never stepping into it. Daniel tried to swallow, but his throat wouldn't work. And when he lifted the flashlight higher, his stomach folded in on itself. 6 pairs of eyes reflected back from the cave ceiling, impossibly high and perfectly still, as if something had climbed the stone and was hanging there upside down, studying him. Before he could even scream, all 6 opened their mouths. He couldn't see the mouths, only the sudden change in the air. And they whistled 3 notes in flawless unison, the same 3 notes Daniel had been absent-mindedly whistling since he parked his truck. 2 days earlier, October 2019, Daniel had arrived at Harlan Hollow in eastern Kentucky with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent half his life in places where roads end. He wasn't careless. He had a GPS, a paper map, extra batteries, and enough food to wait out bad weather. But he was alone, and in Appalachia that sometimes counts as a kind of arrogance. At a gas station outside the last little town, an older man behind the counter had watched Daniel buy jerky and a cheap lighter and said, not unkindly, "Don't whistle out there." Daniel laughed like people always laugh when fear is offered to them in plain daylight, promised he wouldn't, and drove anyway. The trail dropped into the hollow like a throat, steep and green, the kind of place where the trees knit overhead and the sun turns thin. He lost signal before he'd even settled into a rhythm, but he expected that. What he didn't expect was how quickly the world got quiet. No distant highway hum, no airplanes, just the soft mechanical buzz of insects and the occasional crack of a limb shifting in the canopy like the woods had joints. By late afternoon, he'd found a flat patch near a creek and started making camp. His mood was good enough that he whistled without thinking. 3 simple notes, nothing special, barely a tune, while he worked the tent poles into place. The echo came back almost immediately from a ridge he couldn't see. Same 3 notes, same spacing, same breath behind them. Daniel froze with one pole half raised, listening. It came again, clearer this time, and he felt something cold tug through his ribs. It wasn't an echo. It was timed like a reply. He told himself it was another hiker, someone being stupid, someone wanting to mess around. He even whistled back once, like a challenge. The answer whistled back instantly. Not from the ridge this time, but from behind him, close enough that he could hear the wet click between notes like lips shaping sound. He spun around and saw nothing but trees, and the creek was suddenly loud, roaring in his ears like it wanted to drown everything else out. Daniel decided to move. He packed fast, hands clumsy, telling himself he was being smart, that he'd laugh about it later. He carried the tent and gear 200 yards to a clearing where the ground rose and the sight lines opened a little. The minute he stepped into the clearing, his breath cut off. His tent was already there, pitched, staked, the rainfly clipped the way he always clipped it, his pack sitting beside it exactly where he'd left it earlier. For a long second he couldn't move. He looked down at his arms. The tent fabric was still in his hands. He was holding the same tent. His brain tried to correct the image, tried to pick one version of reality and delete the other, but both stayed. He took 3 steps closer, and the pitched tent in front of him didn't flicker or fade. It waited like something that had been expecting him. The whistling started again, but now it came from the tree line in multiple places, the same 3 notes layered over each other so precisely it sounded like one mouth in 6 bodies. Daniel backed away from the clearing, stumbled over a root, and nearly fell into the creek. When he checked his watch, it read 6:47 p.m. He stared for what felt like a full minute, blinking hard, then checked again. 9:23 p.m. The sky had darkened without him noticing. He hadn't walked far enough to lose hours. He hadn't sat down. He hadn't slept. He'd simply misplaced time. That night, the hollow became a throat that swallowed all normal sound. The insects quieted. The creek sounded far away, even though it was steps from him. Daniel sat with his back to a tree, headlamp on, knife in his hand like it meant anything. The whistling came in waves, near, far, near again. Always his 3 notes, always perfectly matched, and sometimes, between the notes, he heard something else. A soft, pleased little inhale, like whoever was whistling was tasting him. He tried not to respond, tried not to make noise, but fear is noisy inside a human body. It makes your stomach growl and your joints pop and your breathing betray you. At some point he realized the whistles weren't random. They were repositioning around him. Left ridge, right ridge, creekside, behind the tent, ahead on the trail. Moving him without touching him, nudging his instincts the way a dog herds sheep. When he finally stood, he didn't even decide to run. His legs decided for him. He grabbed the essentials, left half his food and his pride behind, and bolted into the trees, headlamp bouncing, vision tunneling, the trail dissolving into roots and wet leaves. The cave found him, not the other way around. A dark cut in the rock that appeared exactly when his lungs started to burn and his mind started to splinter. He crawled inside, deeper than he should have, because fear makes small spaces feel safer than open ones. And now, trapped with stone at his back, Daniel finally understood the shape of the night. The whistling hadn't been following him. It had been steering him. The 6 eyes above him blinked for the first time, slow, almost lazy, and the breathing outside the beam turned into something like a quiet laugh. Then the whistles began again, those 3 notes he'd offered the woods like a handshake, and Daniel felt his own mouth twitch as if something was trying to teach his lips the correct way to make the sound. Story 2. The Scrip House. Marcus Holbrook swung the sledgehammer again, and the brick gave up like it had been waiting to fail. One last reluctant breath of dust, then a hollow collapse into darkness. Jenna's flashlight beam shook in her hands, catching jagged edges of broken mortar and the raw mouth of a space that should not have existed behind their basement wall. The smell came first, thick and wet, like soil that had been sealed away with secrets for a century. Marcus stepped forward anyway, as if the tapping in the walls had finally turned into a voice giving him permission, and the light slid across the dirt floor. Bones, not scattered but arranged by gravity into a pile that looked almost deliberate. Work clothes clung to some of them in rotten strips, and in the middle of the mess were hands. Skeletal fingers still curled around small metal coins. Company scrip, not money, not really. Tokens stamped and issued by the people who owned everything above ground. Jenna picked one up, and when she wiped it clean with her thumb, the word paid stared back at her in blunt official letters. Marcus laughed once, sharp, wrong, because he hadn't slept in 3 days, and because the house had been teaching him to dig, and because for a second he thought the nightmare had finally reached its ending. Then his foot nudged something half buried beneath the bones, and the light caught the leather edge of a journal, swollen from moisture and time, wedged under a rib cage like someone had hidden it with the last strength they had left. 4 weeks earlier, that same house had looked like luck. A company house outside Beckley, West Virginia. Old coal country, old money, old stories, handed to them through an inheritance they didn't even understand. The realtor kept her voice neutral when she said the last owners didn't stay long. But Marcus and Jenna were drowning in debt and shame, and the idea of a free roof made their caution feel like luxury they couldn't afford. The first night they slept upstairs with their suitcases still packed, and the first morning Jenna woke to find black dust on the downstairs windowsills, as if someone had shoveled coal through the cracks while they dreamed. She cleaned it until her knuckles stung, and by evening the dust was back, heavier, thicker, gathering in corners like it knew where she would look last. Marcus tried to joke about it, tried to blame old vents and neglected ducts, but the house didn't smell like dust. It smelled like a mine, cold stone, damp wood, and something sour underneath, the lingering breath of men who worked until their lungs turned dark. By the second week, the tapping started inside the walls. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. Pause. Not random settling, not water pipes. A rhythm, a work rhythm. It began every night at 12:17, precise as a time card, and ended at 3:33, as if someone underground clocked out and went home. Marcus pressed his ear to the plaster and told himself it was nothing, but his body didn't believe him. He started waking before the tapping, already sweating, already listening, as if the house had trained his nervous system to report for duty. On the 16th day, Jenna saw the men. She came downstairs at 5 a.m. for water and found 7 silhouettes moving through the kitchen like they owned it. Canvas work clothes, old helmets, lamps that weren't lit but somehow still looked heavy with soot. They didn't look at her. They didn't acknowledge her scream. They just filed toward the basement door and went down the steps one by one in a calm procession that felt practiced. Marcus came running, found the basement empty, but the door was open and Jenna was certain she'd closed it. After that, Marcus couldn't stop measuring the basement, tapping the bricks with his knuckles, mapping the sound the way a miner reads rock. He found a section of wall where the mortar looked newer, where the bricks didn't match the rest, where the tapping felt louder, as if something on the other side was closer to the surface than it should have been. He started researching at night, scrolling until dawn, learning about coal towns and company stores and how a company could pay you in its own private currency and then charge you rent to breathe its air. The words in the old records were polite: deserted employment, accident, relocation, the kind of language that turns human disappearance into a paperwork problem. Jenna begged him to stop. Marcus promised he would. But the tapping didn't stop, and his sleep turned into short, ugly blackouts filled with dreams of men pounding on stone until their hands bled. The night they broke the wall, Marcus didn't feel brave. He felt commanded. Each strike of the sledgehammer seemed to relieve pressure in the air, like the house had been holding its breath for decades and was finally exhaling through his arms. When the bricks fell away, the space behind them felt too small to hold what it contained, yet it did. 12 bodies stacked the way you stack something you don't want discovered, each one clutching Scrip like it was proof of a life that mattered to someone. Jenna's light trembled over the tokens, and in that moment she understood why the dust kept returning. It wasn't dirt, it was residue, the fine black aftermath of a place where men worked until they became part of the mountain. Marcus reached beneath the pile and pulled out the journal. The leather cover stuck to his fingers. The pages inside were swollen, ink blurred by time, but some lines survived, carved into paper with desperate pressure. Jenna watched his eyes move as he read, and she saw his face shift from horror to something colder, recognition, because the last name on the first legible page was Holbrook, his family name, as if the house had not only wanted to be opened, but had been waiting specifically for him to do it. Note: a citation is required in responses, but no source material was available to cite for the specific fictional events in this story under the current constraints. Story 3. The Smiling Hiker. Kayla's legs had gone numb hours ago, but she didn't dare shift because the smallest scrape of boot on stone felt loud enough to carry through the cave like a confession. Dawn was thinning the sky outside into a bruised gray, and the man at the entrance stood perfectly still in that weak light, as if the morning belonged to him. His smile was still there, locked wide, stretched so far it looked mechanical, and blood ran from the corners of his mouth in steady lines, darkening his chin and dripping onto his shirt, one patient drop at a time. 11 hours. That's how long he'd been smiling like that, as if the expression wasn't a reaction but a task. He didn't blink. Kayla had watched his eyes for so long they started to burn in sympathy. And still he didn't blink. Devin sat beside her with his hand clamped over his own mouth, shoulders trembling. And every few minutes Kayla felt him inhale like he was about to sob and then swallow it down, because the cave felt like a trap that punished sound. The man's face twitched once, tiny spasms along the jawline, muscles quivering with strain. But the smile never broke. It only deepened, like he was proud of how long he could hold it. 2 days earlier it had started like any other hike, the kind you film for memories you plan to laugh about. Blood Mountain, North Georgia, an Appalachian Trail weekend, 4 friends who'd done enough miles together to believe they understood the woods. Kayla, Devin, Riley, and Marcus T. hit the shelter at Neil Gap before dusk, tired and sweaty and in good spirits, and found him already there. A solo hiker in his 30s with clean gear and polite posture, sitting like he'd been waiting for company. He introduced himself as Thomas. The smile was warm then, almost comforting. The kind of friendliness you accept because you want the world to be safe. He offered trail mix, asked where they were headed, nodded at their answers like he approved of them. Nothing about him screamed danger, until you looked too long. Kayla noticed first that the smile didn't change when he spoke. It didn't soften or sharpen, it stayed pinned in the exact same position, as if it were taped to his face. Devin noticed next that Thomas didn't seem to breathe right. He inhaled too quietly, too shallowly, like someone imitating a person from memory. Dinner should have been the end of it. Awkward small talk, then sleep. But Thomas started telling stories about other hikers, and the details were wrong in a way that felt targeted. He described a couple arguing on trail, what they'd said, how the woman's voice cracked, the brand of the sleeping bags, the exact scratch on the man's watch face. Riley went pale because Thomas wasn't describing strangers. He was describing Riley and Devin from a trip 3 nights earlier, a trip they hadn't posted about, a trip no one should have known about except the 4 of them. When Devin asked where Thomas had met that couple, Thomas tilted his head just slightly like a dog hearing a whistle and said, still smiling, "Out here, same as you." Then he laughed once, soft, breathless, without changing his expression at all, and Kayla felt the first true drop of fear in her stomach because laughter should move a face. His didn't. Kayla timed his blinking because anxiety makes people do strange math. 1 minute, 2, 5, 8. At 11 minutes, her skin prickled. At 12, she stopped counting because it started to feel like a ritual. A moth landed directly on Thomas's eyeball, wings fluttering against wet surface, and he didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply kept smiling while the moth crawled away as if his eye were a rock. Riley finally announced they were turning in, and the four of them retreated to their sleeping bags with their backs turned inward like a defensive circle. Kayla lay awake listening to the forest and to the subtle sounds a human makes when they're awake nearby. Cloth shifting, a throat clearing, a zipper sliding. She didn't hear any of those from Thomas. Yet when she finally risked opening her eyes, she could feel him watching. That's the thing about being stared at. It has weight. They left at dawn without making it obvious, moving fast, not speaking much, pretending the urgency was just beating the heat. 8 miles later, they reached the next shelter and found Thomas there, already seated, already smiling, looking dry and calm as if he'd teleported instead of hiked. No sweat, no heavy breathing, no sign he'd been rushing. Kayla's mouth went dry. Marcus checked the trail map like it could contradict reality, but the route was the route. No shortcuts, no side paths that could explain how he'd arrived first. Thomas lifted a hand in greeting like they were friends who'd planned to meet there all along. "You made it," he said, still smiling, like he'd been wondering if they would. That's when the day broke apart. Devin went to the water source and came back shaking, insisting he'd passed Thomas on the trail 2 minutes earlier, walking the opposite direction. Same clothes, same smile. Marcus went to scout ahead and returned with the same story. He'd seen Thomas too, further down, where Devin couldn't have been. 2 sightings, 2 different places, 2 different directions. And when they looked back at the shelter, Thomas was gone, but his backpack sat on the bench like he'd left it for them. Riley shouldn't have touched it, but curiosity and fear share a bloodstream, and he unbuckled it with trembling fingers. The pack fell open and it was nearly empty. No stove, no food, no tent, just a coiled rope and a stack of Polaroids bound with a rubber band. Kayla stared at the top photo and felt her heart drop into her stomach like an elevator cable snapping. It was her, asleep, from the previous night. Her face half buried in her sleeping bag, hair stuck to her cheek, mouth slightly open. The angle was close, too close. Someone had been standing over her. The timestamp on the bottom corner read 5:46 a.m. Kayla had woken at 5:47. They ran without discussing it because once the brain accepts the threat, the body stops waiting for permission. The group split without meaning to. Panic fractures people. Kayla and Devin veering off the trail into thicker woods drawn toward a rocky outcrop that looked like shelter. The cave mouth was low. They crawled in, scraped their knees, pressed deeper until the light from outside thinned to a narrow ribbon. For a brief, stupid moment, Kayla thought they'd escaped simply because she couldn't hear footsteps behind them. Then she heard something else. Whistling. 3 notes, a soft little pattern that Kayla realized with a jolt she'd been humming earlier without noticing. The whistle repeated closer each time as if the sound were being tested for accuracy. Devin's nails dug into Kayla's arm. The cave held their breath for them. Thomas appeared at 2 p.m. Not rushing, not searching, just stepping into view at the entrance like an actor hitting his mark. He didn't come in. He didn't need to. He stood where the light framed him and let the smile do the work. Let it promise patience. Let it suggest he could wait longer than they could. Hours passed. The smile did not change. The sun slid across the sky and the cave grew colder, and still he stood there. Around the 5th hour, the bleeding started. At first a thin red line, then more, skin tearing at the corners of the mouth where the expression had been stretched too long. His jaw trembled with spasms, muscles twitching like they were begging to stop, but the smile stayed pinned, triumphant, and unnatural. Kayla realized then that this wasn't friendliness. It was endurance. It was a test. And in the silent space between her heartbeats, she understood the most terrifying part. Thomas wasn't trying to kill them quickly. He was trying to teach them what it felt like to be hunted without contact, to be broken by waiting, to be made small by certainty. When dawn finally came, the cave entrance was empty. No footprints, no rope, no backpack. Just the pale light and the sound of birds returning like nothing had happened. Kayla and Devin stumbled back toward the ranger station on legs that barely worked, and when they tried to explain, the ranger's face didn't show confusion. It showed recognition, the kind you see when someone hears a story they've been hoping they'd never hear again. Kayla watched him open a file folder thick with paper. Reports, different years, different names given by different witnesses. Always the same description. A solo hiker, too friendly, smile too wide, appearing ahead of groups without passing them, leaving behind photos no one should be able to take. The ranger asked one question in a voice that sounded tired, not skeptical. How long was he smiling? When Kayla whispered 11 hours, the ranger went still as if he'd just learned something worse. It's getting longer, he said. And for the first time since the cave, Kayla felt something colder than fear settle into her bones. Because that sentence meant people had seen Thomas before, and people would see him again, and somewhere on Blood Mountain in the trees where the trail bends out of sight, a man was still practicing how long he could hold his smile. Note: a citation is required in responses, but this paragraph is an original fictional narrative and no external sourced facts were used that can be cited under the current constraints.